The departure from Busby Camp marks the beginning of the final chapter of the Custer campaign, a phase that has fueled over 137 years of debate and controversy. While the days leading up to the march from Busby are well documented, nearly every moment from the regiment's departure at sunset on June 24th until the Sioux and Cheyenne withdrew from the area on the evening of June 26th has been a subject of dispute. Custer issued the order for the column to move at 11 p.m., which, according to key figures such as Fred Benteen, Marcus Reno, George Herendeen, Captain Miles Moylan, Luke Hare, Carlo DiRudio, and Nick Wallace, was actually 10:03 p.m. local time. Wallace initially recorded the time as 1 a.m. in a report from January 1877, but later revised it during the 1879 Reno Inquiry, adjusting his account to align more closely with others, setting the departure time at 11 p.m. The darkness of that night raises questions about how anyone could have determined the time with absolute precision. Perhaps the flickering glow of campfires provided enough light for a timepiece to be read. It is plausible that Custer gave the order at 11 p.m. and the regiment began moving shortly thereafter. Those positioned farther back in the column may have perceived a slight delay in movement. Ed Godfrey and Fred Gerard suggested that the actual departure occurred closer to 11:30 p.m. Given the range of accounts, an estimated departure time of 11 p.m. seems reasonable, with the entire command likely in motion by 11:30 or 11:45 p.m. John Gray, in his analysis, proposed a later start of 12:30 a.m., though his argument lacks substantial evidence. If we consider Gray's pursuit of historical accuracy, it remains debatable whether compromising on such details truly serves the greater historical narrative. Benteen's account, which estimates that it took an hour and a half to cross Muddy Creek, placing its completion at 12:30 a.m., 11:33 p.m. local time, supports the idea that the march commenced shortly after 11 p.m. One fact remains relatively certain. The march from Busby to the first halt covered approximately 6.2 to 6.7 miles, depending on the precise starting and ending points. While some portions of the terrain presented challenges, the overall route was navigable, involving a gradual ascent from 2,340 feet to 4,000 feet, leading toward the divide 11.5 miles away. The length of the column likely contributed to discrepancies in the recorded timing. Approximately 640 men, including 605 soldiers, departed Busby Camp en route to the divide. This figure excludes scouts such as Charles Varnum, Mitch Boyer, and Reynolds. The troops advanced in a column of twos, a formation standard for 1876, with their lines stretching nearly 2/3 of a mile. This estimate does not include the 175 pack mules, which added at least another 500 feet. Some scholars suggest the mules were driven in an orderly formation akin to the soldiers, while others contend that they moved in a more chaotic cluster. Given the rugged terrain, the scarcity of civilian packers, and the darkness of night, the latter seems unlikely. The pack train remained a persistent challenge. Even the relatively small Rosebud River forced Custer to halt and secure the packs on June 22nd. As the troops progressed through the valley, crossing the river multiple times, the mules struggled against the rough landscape. Wallace observed that the trail followed elevated ground with poor soil and dense sagebrush, whereas the lower valley provided more fertile land, offering better grazing and large cottonwoods. By the time the command broke camp at 5 a.m. on June 23rd, Fred Benteen's H Company was positioned at the rear, tasked with managing the troublesome mules. At one point during the day, the column had to pause to allow the pack train to catch up. Even after Custer ordered the regiment to establish camp at 4:30 p.m., the last of the mules did not arrive until sunset. Benteen, increasingly frustrated with the persistent delays, proposed a solution to First Lieutenant William Weiner Cook, who declined to relay it to Custer. The next day, however, Benteen approached Custer directly. To his surprise, Custer was receptive to the suggestion. Benteen's method, positioning companies in front, beside, and behind the mules, proved somewhat effective, though the animals remained an ongoing challenge. The new strategy alleviated some of the logistical difficulties, at least until Miles Keogh encountered further trouble with the pack train while crossing Mud Creek. The crossing posed a significant obstacle, delaying the column for approximately 90 minutes. Benteen recounted how Keogh, responsible for the rear guard, supervised the crossing while the rest of the column waited impatiently. Benteen's colorful description suggests the task was anything but simple. "If it took a minute to cross that packed train over the muddy," he remarked, "it took 2 hours." Despite the delay, the column resumed its march, advancing at a reasonable pace given the challenging nocturnal conditions. The long, stretched-out formation likely resulted in fluctuating speeds, with the column expanding and contracting between 1 and 3 miles in length. If the march began at 11 p.m. and concluded around 2:15 a.m., then the column covered approximately 6.2 to 6.7 miles, averaging a pace of roughly 2 miles per hour. The vanguard likely pressed forward while Keogh and the rear guard managed the pack mules. Leading the column was Half Yellow Face, a Crow Scout, while Gerard and the Re-Scouts were responsible for tracking any diverging trails to the left. Godfrey later recounted that dust obscured visibility, and the clatter of equipment and horses made it difficult to hear anything beyond one's immediate surroundings. The troops relied on the dust cloud ahead to maintain their formation, occasionally stopping to reorient themselves. Although Godfrey's Company K was not at the front, he noted the considerable challenge of keeping the column together in the darkness. Despite the difficulties, the troops maintained a steady trot for much of the march, covering nearly 7 miles. By 2:15 a.m., Custer made the decision to halt the regiment, realizing they would not reach the divide before daybreak. Various sources provide slightly different estimates for the halt, with some suggesting a stop as early as 1:30 a.m., while others indicate as late as 2:45 a.m. regardless of the precise timing. This march set the stage for the events that would soon unfold, culminating in one of the most debated battles in American history. The general consensus is that the column came to a halt before dawn. The march resumed at 11 p.m. and continued through the night. Once again, the horses were left without food. By approximately 8 to 8:45 a.m., movement recommenced, with the regiment having covered roughly 10 miles overnight. At times, I lost all sense of time, unable to check my watch in the darkness. Perhaps the clearest indication that the column halted around 2:15 a.m. comes from Benteen's account. He observed that daylight began creeping in about an hour and a half after they stopped. This aligns closely with nautical twilight, which commenced roughly an hour and 26 minutes later. The timeline suggests a reasonable pace of around 2 miles per hour over a distance of 6.5 miles, which is consistent with the conditions they faced. Any significant deviation from this timing would create inconsistencies in the overall sequence of events. This reasoning also brings Wallace's mention of daylight into closer alignment with other testimonies. It is worth considering the significance of these precise times to Wallace and others, such as Hare, Herendeen, or Godfrey. If Wallace was unable to check his watch when the regiment halted, it would have been equally difficult to do so when they began marching at approximately 11 o'clock or 11:30 p.m., long after civil twilight had ended. We sometimes assign greater weight to these testimonies than they deserve. When Luke Hare stated that the column arrived before daylight, his focus was likely on his surroundings rather than pinpointing an exact time. Historians often strive to establish precise moments, but Hare's statement suggests that while he did not know the exact hour, it was certainly before dawn. Nautical twilight began at 2:44 a.m., with civil twilight following at 3:41 a.m., meaning it would still have been too dark to read a watch clearly. As Hare dismounted and took in his surroundings, the faint traces of light may have given him the impression that the darkness was gradually lifting. During the Reno Court of Inquiry, Captain Moylan was asked about the timing of daylight in that region at that time of year. His response, between 2 and 3 o'clock, was about daylight. This testimony helps align the accounts of Hare, Wallace, and Herendeen with those of Godfrey, Moylan, Benteen, and Reno. Gerard's observations remain an outlier. Custer had instructed Gerard to track even the smallest trails to the left, which may explain his late arrival. Civil twilight began at 3:34 a.m., well before sunrise at 4:13 a.m., and long after the first troops had reached their halt. Historian John Gray estimated a halt at 3:15 a.m., which suggests the column covered about 7 miles at a speed of 2.55 miles per hour. Gray's calculation of distance is slightly off, by about 0.3 to 0.8 of a mile, but not dramatically so. What is curious is his use of local time, which, when converted to St. Paul time, indicates a departure at 1:50 a.m. and an arrival at 4:12 a.m. These times seem detached from the reality experienced by those on the march. While Gray's estimates are relatively close, they feel somewhat forced when compared to Gerard's notes. It appears that Benteen and Moylan were near the front of the regiment, though neither led the column. Moylan's estimate of leaving at 11 p.m. and halting at 1:30 a.m. suggests a pace of approximately 2.68 miles per hour, closely matching Gray's calculations, despite differences in specific times. Given the broader timeline from 11 p.m. to 2:15 a.m., a more modest speed of 1.9 to 2.1 miles per hour seems more plausible. It is unfortunate that no first-hand account from Keogh survives, though some fragile evidence hints at his involvement. First Sergeant John Ryan of M Company made an indirect reference to the arrangement of the pack train, implying that Companies C and M were under Keogh's command. Some sources claim that Fred Gerard said half yellow face and Bloody Knife warned Custer that they would not be able to cross the divide before daylight without being spotted by Sioux scouts. However, it remains unclear how Bloody Knife, a re-scout unfamiliar with the terrain, could have known this with certainty. The claim that the troops assembled at the Busby halt is frequently misrepresented, a reflection of the often careless scholarship surrounding these events. According to Gerard, the column departed around 11:30 p.m., and he, along with half Yellow Face and Bloody Knife, moved to the front, awaiting Custer's arrival. When Custer reached them, he instructed Gerard to scout far to the left. At some point, Custer paused, and Gerard dispatched scouts to locate the trail. While they waited, Custer asked the two scouts whether they could cross the divide before daylight. They responded that they could not. He then inquired whether crossing in daylight would allow them to remain undetected, and they again replied no. According to Reno, this exchange took place around 2 a.m., which aligns well with the estimated halt time. However, Reno's overall timeline has often been questioned. These seemingly minor events, when pieced together, reveal a larger issue: Custer's realization that crossing the divide unnoticed would be difficult. This likely influenced his decision to press forward with a smaller detachment. While the main column left Busby and proceeded up Davis Creek, Lieutenant Varnum and his scouts had already advanced ahead, making their way toward a high point known as the Crow's Nest. Interestingly, the term Crow's Nest is somewhat misleading. The actual location is more of a bowl-shaped depression used historically by Crow warriors for hiding stolen horses. From this position, one cannot see anything to the west, the direction of Custer's approach. The scouts had to dismount and climb on foot to reach the true summit. Just as Custer's column reached its first halt around 2 a.m., Varnum arrived at the Crow's Nest approximately 4.5 to 5 miles ahead. Exhausted from the journey, he collapsed into sleep as it was still too dark to observe anything in the distance. Some debate remains over whether Varnum and his scouts actually reached the true Crow's Nest. Author Vern Smalley has suggested that the Crow scouts leading Varnum's party became disoriented in the darkness and mistakenly ended up on the divide instead. If so, they may have later concealed their error out of embarrassment. Smalley supports this theory by analyzing Varnum's later remarks about how he approached the summit. Ultimately, the exact locations of Custer's forces and the scouts when they surveyed the valleys below remain uncertain, adding yet another layer of mystery to an already complex historical event. Historian James Willard proposed that the location in question was a rounded, oval-shaped hill southeast of where the trail crossed the divide, approximately half a mile from the camp marker. This elevated position offered a vantage point comparable to the higher peak and was easily accessible from the trail. Willard described the area as featuring tall grass and pine trees, which provided natural concealment, making it a logical observation post. Another historian, Edgar Stewart, remained uncertain, suggesting that the site was likely the fourth peak south of the pass. Debates over the exact timing of events become somewhat inconsequential in light of what followed. However, the strongest argument on either side lies in the broader strategic perspective. The scouts' journey from Busby Camp to Crow's Nest was slow, taking them over 5 hours through the thick darkness of night, progressing at barely 2 miles per hour. The delay can largely be attributed to the Crow scouts pausing to rest and smoke in dense brush near the stream. Given that there were still several hours of darkness ahead, there was little urgency at the time. Upon reaching Crow's Nest, Varnum, Mitch Boyer, and White Man Runsham led the horses into a sheltered hollow. Most of the scouts rested, awaiting daylight, while Harry Moccasin and White Man Runsham ascended to the summit. As civil twilight approached around 3:30 a.m., the two Crow scouts noticed what appeared to be the faint glow of distant campfires flickering against the early morning sky. They immediately hurried back to report their findings. Varnum, suffering from sore eyes due to dust and exhaustion, struggled to see clearly from the heights. 2 abandoned teepees were also spotted along Ash or Reno Creek, likely identified through telescopes since they were several miles away. Varnum hastily recorded these observations in a note and entrusted it to Red Star, a young Scout, for delivery to Custer. At this point, discrepancies arise. Historian Vern Smalley claimed that the message was dispatched around 3:45 a.m., while others suggest it was closer to 4 a.m. Varnum himself later stated that he sent the messenger just after 5 a.m., which aligns better with the gradual increase in visibility. Varnum later recounted, "Around 5 o'clock, I wrote a note to the general, implying that while sunrise was officially at 4:13 a.m. from their elevated position, it likely felt later." It is difficult to imagine a fatigued and sleep-deprived Varnum accurately discerning details in the dim, hazy, pre-dawn light. This makes it plausible that he refrained from reporting anything prematurely, despite the Crow Scouts' insistence. The incident underscores how little emphasis was placed on exact times during the campaign. As someone seasoned by frontier life, Varnum likely had an intuitive sense of sunrise patterns, yet he did not strictly rely on his watch. His reference to 5 a.m. may have been based on military headquarters time, which would have translated to around 4 o'clock or even 3 a.m. local time, too dark for clear observations. This confusion between local and headquarters time is a recurring challenge throughout historical records. Although Varnum is generally considered a reliable source, his recounting requires careful interpretation as it condenses events and timings into a historical blur. The distance from Crow's Nest to Custer's initial halt was approximately 4.5 miles, an easy ride in daylight. A fast rider could cover that ground in under 45 minutes. Yet, accounts vary regarding how long it took Red Star to deliver the note. Red Star himself stated that, despite his companion's horse going lame, he pressed forward with urgency, fully aware of the importance of his mission. As a young man, likely between 18 and 22 years old, this task was a badge of honor, symbolizing the trust the soldiers placed in him. Upon arrival, he was warmly received by fellow Scouts, who recognized the significance of his message. Writers such as Jack Pennington and James Willard support Red Star's version, noting that he gauged the sun's position upon reaching the camp around 6 a.m. If Varnum had indeed sent the note around 5 a.m., it is reasonable to assume that Red Star reached Custer by 6 a.m., particularly given his determination to press on despite his companion's misfortune. Meanwhile, Varnum scouts observed Sioux warriors roughly a mile and a half to the west, moving toward the soldiers' camp. Concerned that the enemy might spot the troops' smoke and expose their position, Varnum led a small group to intercept them. However, just as they were about to set off, they were abruptly called back. The Sioux had changed direction. The scouts watched as the warriors crossed the divide and altered course once more, this time toward a gap in the terrain. Around the same time, Red Star reportedly arrived at camp, delivering the crucial news of the Sioux encampment. It is notable how indifferent he seemed about his companion's lame horse, reinforcing the idea that he was intent on completing his task without unnecessary delays. White Man runs him later claimed that Custer reached Crow's Nest by 6 a.m., further supporting the notion that Red Star rode swiftly and efficiently. While accounts from native scouts often require careful interpretation when translated into Western timekeeping, Red Star's description aligns well with known distances and travel speeds. Estimating his pace at roughly 7 miles per hour, including occasional pauses to check on his companion's horse, his account appears both urgent and realistic. Anecdotal evidence suggests that upon arriving at camp, Red Star first relayed his message to Bloody Knife, who then alerted Isaiah Dorman, the Dakota interpreter. Dorman, in turn, informed Private John Berkman, who roused Custer. After reading Varnum's note and hearing Red Star's report, Custer wasted no time in preparing to move. Known for his ability to function on minimal sleep, he quickly gave the command to prepare for departure. By approximately 7:20 a.m. local time, 8:17 a.m. headquarters time, Custer was likely waking his men for the final push. However, the absence of formal orders or trumpet calls remains a point of contention. Some recalled hearing the trumpet, while others, including Benteen, did not. Nevertheless, Red Star's version of events, combined with the timing of his ride, aligns well with other credible sources. The discrepancy between local and headquarters time continues to require careful consideration, but overall, his swift return and Custer's subsequent movements fit within the established framework of that fateful morning. Lieutenant Edward Godfrey later noted, "We began promptly at 8 o'clock and marched without stopping until 10:30 a.m., when we took a break in a deep ravine covering about 10 miles. On closer examination, while the timing aligns with other accounts, his mention of 10 miles appears inaccurate. Calculating the speed suggests an unrealistic pace of 4 miles per hour, casting doubt on the accuracy of his recollection. In reality, the first halt was only about 4.5 miles from Crow's Nest, with a second halt, where the march ended, just 3.5 miles farther. It is likely that Godfrey, recalling these events 15 years later, misremembered the distance, perhaps merging different stages of the march in his mind. Other officers, such as Miles Moylan, confirmed the 8 a.m. departure. Luke Hare gave a broader estimate of between 8 o'clock and 9 a.m., while George Wallace initially suggested a time frame between 8 o'clock and 8:45 a.m. before settling on 8:45 a.m. during the Reno inquiry. These variations are particularly curious for a man responsible for maintaining a precise itinerary. Benteen recalled covering approximately 1.5 miles before reaching the next halt, which, when compared to Godfrey's reported 10 miles, only deepens the confusion. Were they even describing the same sequence of events? One intriguing theory, proposed by historian Vern Smalley, suggests that Custer never actually ascended Crow's Nest at all. Instead, Smalley argues that Custer observed the valleys from a lower vantage point, what he refers to as Varnum's Lookout. While this remains speculative, it adds yet another layer of complexity to an already heavily scrutinized historical event. However, little concrete evidence supports this claim. When I visited the area in 2007, I found the site identified as the supposed holding ground for the horses to be too small and muddy to accommodate 15 mounts without significant risk of injury. While Varnum's Lookout provides a reasonable vantage point, it is vastly inferior to the view from Crow's Nest, which rises 400 feet higher. Given the strategic importance of visibility, anyone conducting reconnaissance would naturally choose the higher ground. During the Reno inquiry, Fred Gerard described a small ravine and a spring along the ascent to the lookout, reinforcing the argument that Crow's Nest was the more logical. Observation point. Historian James Willard, echoing Vern Smalley's skepticism, speculated that Custer might not have made the full climb to Crow's Nest, but instead observed the valley from an elevated position north of Davis Creek. Despite these differing interpretations, it would be premature to entirely dismiss Varnum's Lookout as it appears in multiple accounts and discussions. What remains clear is that Custer did indeed survey Reno Creek and the Little Bighorn Valley, though exactly what he saw and how he interpreted it remains a matter of debate. No immediate tactical decisions emerged from his observations. Records suggest that Custer spent over an hour at Crow's Nest, though estimates of his arrival vary significantly. Historian John Gray suggests he arrived shortly after 9 a.m., while Smalley's timeline places it at 8:45 a.m., and Willard argues for as late as 9:30 a.m. These discrepancies raise the question of how a man as notoriously impatient as Custer could have taken nearly 2 hours to traverse just 4 miles. In reality, he did not waste time. The timeline indicates that after receiving Red Star's message, he swiftly roused his command, and by 8 a.m., he had already departed, unable to wait for his regiment to fully catch up. Custer's impatience was well documented, with many of his officers attesting to it over the years. In a letter dated July 9, 1925, historian William Graham asked Charles Varnum and Edward Edgerly about an alleged 45-minute halt that Custer supposedly made after sending a message to Benteen while Reno's troops were engaged. Varnum dismissed the claim outright, remarking, "Anyone who knew G.A. Custer would find it hard to believe he could sit still for 5 minutes in that situation." Edgerly, too, found a suggestion implausible. This impatience was a defining characteristic of Custer's leadership. General Allard Bayard Nettleton, a fellow Civil War veteran, once praised Custer's ability to make lightning-fast decisions and inspire his troops with a thunderbolt of energy in combat. Such descriptions, swift, impulsive, and dynamic, depict a commander unlikely to have leisurely ascended Crow's Nest. Rather, he would have charged ahead, leaving his regiment to follow. The sequence of events leading up to Custer's arrival at Crow's Nest was equally chaotic. After Red Star reached camp at approximately 6:55 a.m., there was a brief period of excitement and informal discussion. By 7:05 a.m., Isaiah Dorman, the Dakota interpreter, spotted Red Star in the scouts' camp and sent Private John Berkman to wake Custer. By 7:20 a.m., Custer, still shaking off sleep, was en route to the scouts' camp. After reviewing the situation and reading Varnum's note, he was ready to act by 7:45 a.m., and by 8 a.m., orders were being issued. True to form, Custer did not linger. By 8:10 a.m., he was already on the move, covering the distance to Crow's Nest at a rapid pace and reaching the observation pocket by 8:35 a.m. Crow's Nest was easily recognizable, particularly if one followed the tracks along the southern edge of Davis Creek Valley, as Varnum had done. Upon spotting Custer's approach, Varnum descended the hill to greet him while the horses were being corralled. By approximately 9 a.m., Custer was scanning the Little Bighorn Valley through his field glasses. However, the sight of the village below did not appear to leave a strong impression on him. In a 1909 letter to historian Walter Camp, Varnum recalled discussing the previous night's events with Custer, accompanied by Tom Custer and Lieutenant James Calhoun. However, inconsistencies in Varnum's later memoirs, where he omitted Calhoun, raised questions about the precise accuracy of his recollection. Nonetheless, what remains clear is Custer's tendency to act independently, often scouting ahead while his regiment struggled to maintain pace. As Custer surveyed from Crow's Nest, the rest of his command lagged behind, delayed by unwieldy pack mules and general confusion among officers. The march was slow and disorganized, with no clear instructions communicated. Officers such as Lieutenant William Cook, Major Marcus Reno, and Captain Frederick Benteen were left uncertain about the plan while Custer pressed forward alone. By the time Custer decided to leave Crow's Nest, it was likely already after 10 a.m. While some officers, including Godfrey, Hare, Moylan, and Wallace, claimed the regiment arrived between 10 o'clock and 10:30 a.m., it seems improbable that a commander as aggressive as Custer would have taken more than 2 hours to reach Crow's Nest after a grueling 40-day campaign and a forced night march. This suggests the main command arrived later than its leader, reinforcing the idea that Custer moved ahead without waiting. Red Star's comment that Custer rode back to meet his troops lends support to the officers' accounts and cast doubt on some of Varnum's later recollections. Another potential inaccuracy in Varnum's post-battle testimony concerns Robert Jackson, a re-scout. Varnum claimed Jackson was among the scouts during the Rosebud River March, but historian Vern Smalley's research suggests otherwise. According to Smalley, Jackson left on June 23rd to deliver letters home and reached the Yellowstone Depot by June 25th, where he was seen by Private Harvey Fox of D Company. Fox's presence at the depot is well documented, and Smalley's findings align with this account. Other accounts, including those of Private George Glenn and Scout George Herendeen, indicate that Jackson was not at the Little Bighorn on June 25th or 26th, but had instead returned to the Powder River Depot. Additionally, Young Hawk, another re-scout, confirmed Jackson's presence in camp after the battle, not during it. These testimonies suggest that Jackson had already been discharged or possibly re-enlisted by June 25th, making his presence at the regiment's final approach highly unlikely. Meanwhile, other significant events were unfolding. Sergeant William Curtis of Captain Yates' Company F discovered that some of his gear had gone missing, likely dropped during the march. During the Reno inquiry, Miles Moylan recalled that Curtis was sent back to retrieve his lost belongings, accompanied by 4 men, Rooney, Brown, Bruce, and another soldier. Along the way, they encountered 3 Cheyenne warriors rummaging through the discarded supplies. These warriors were likely from Little Wolf's band at Red Cloud's agency, perhaps the same men who had first spotted the regiment. Curtis and his men drove them off, but could not prevent them from later attempting to alert the nearby village. Moylan noted that Curtis was dispatched shortly before the command halted at the foot of the divide, but it is likely Curtis realized the missing gear during the first halt, which lasted about 6 hours as troops rested and prepared meals. The second halt was shorter, about an hour and a half, and lacked such comforts. Historian Richard Hardorf estimated Curtis's round trip at 5 miles, but in reality, it was closer to 4.5. Given the distances involved, Curtis and his men likely completed the trip in under an hour. This would explain why Custer had a few extra minutes atop Crow's Nest, aligning with other reported events. As Custer descended from the lookout, he received various updates, including Curtis's report. At some point, Tom Custer and Jim Calhoun allegedly rode out to relay Curtis's findings to George Custer. One debated account claims that upon hearing the report, Custer exclaimed, "Tom, who in the devil moved these troops forward? My orders were to remain in camp all day and attack the Indians at night, but they've discovered us and are on the run." Whether this quote is accurate remains uncertain, but historian Bruce Liddick has suggested that Custer may have simply forgotten to countermand his original orders. If so, it would have been yet another lapse in communication in the hours leading up to one of the most infamous battles in American history. In a 2007 research review, Tom Heskey identified this location as McDougal Ravine, named after Keith McDougal, who had also discovered artifacts there. However, McDougal Ravine is actually located east of the site proposed by Dr. Richard Fox, adding another layer of complexity to the debate. While it is tempting to assign the regiment's halt to a single ravine, it is crucial to remember that Custer's column was extensive, stretching out over considerable terrain. It would have been impossible to fully conceal within a single ravine, as the formation moved slowly and adapted sluggishly to hidden locations off the main route. Various eyewitnesses provided their own recollections of this moment. Captain Miles Moylan reported that the halt occurred at the base of the divide. Lieutenant Hare noted that the column remained hidden about half a mile from the divide for roughly an hour, sometime between 10 a.m. and noon. Charles Varnum estimated that the column reached the divide around 10 a.m. Private Theodore Golden recalled that after marching for 2 hours from 8 a.m., they took shelter in a ravine at the base of the divide, remaining hidden for a time. Lieutenant Edward Edgerly added that the regiment had halted by 10 a.m., approximately 15 miles from the Indian village, while Custer observed from an elevated position with the Crow and re-scouts. Shortly after, the officer's call was sounded. The McDougal Ravine theory holds some merit, but it is likely that Custer's column made multiple stops along the route. stretching from this ravine to positions behind Crow's Nest. The troops likely took advantage of natural cover across various ravines. By this time, Custer had received multiple reports from his scouts about the size of the enemy village. Charlie Reynolds, Mitch Boyer, and the Crow Scouts all confirmed the presence of a vast encampment. Yet Custer remained skeptical. From his vantage point atop Crow's Nest, he saw no clear evidence of a village, despite the insistence of